In this episode, we're going to deal with Athanasius. Um, Athanasius was a secretary and deacon to a man named Alexander, who was the bishop of Alexandria. And this was during the time of the Council of Nicaea. At the conclusion of the Council of Nicaea, since they had to set dates that were the same throughout the world for when Easter was to be celebrated, the decision of who would decide those dates was given to Alexandria, because Alexandria had a history of knowledge, and specifically speaking of the Library of Alexandria, there was a center of astronomy where they followed the movements of the celestial objects, and so they could determine times and seasons and all the rest. And so these are the people who could do the calculations to figure out when these events were supposed to be. Eventually, Athanasius took the place of Alexander as Bishop of Alexandria. And before the council, by the way, he had already written a work called On the Incarnation, and it was about the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ. And is centered on its importance for Christianity and Christian thought and Christian theology, and why it was so important that God was made manifest inside of a human form, inside of a human body. That Jesus, in fact, was the incarnation of God on earth, and this was the linchpin of Christianity from his perspective, right? And so that's why when the Arianism developed, it became such an issue for Alexandria in particular, because it had been the center of learning and a center of learning for Christianity for some time already. So these thoughts and this theology was already present prior to Arius and his theology. But what's interesting about this is that after Athanasius becomes the Bishop of Alexandria, the church-state relations that was spoken out about before were a problem for him, because as the different emperors favored or disfavored Arianism, Alexandria, the Bishop of Alexandria, was removed, and that bishop was Athanasius. In fact, over his 45 years as bishop, he was exiled 5 times. 5 times, essentially, he was taken and deported out of the Roman Empire for his views because they did not align with Arian teaching. And 5 times he returned. So this continued to happen throughout his life, and he never really saw the resolution of that, because he died in the year 373. And in the year 381, there was some finality to it at the Council of Constantinople and the development of the Nicene Creed in its fullness in the way that it is today. But nevertheless, every year, the Bishop of Alexandria was charged with writing what they called a Festal letter. And this letter was to go out, to be sent out to the Roman Empire, to the various bishoprics. And at that time, it had begun to develop the same structure as the government. Basically, parishes and dioceses, like what exists within, say, Roman Catholicism today, those various districts had developed from the state, from the Roman Empire, and he's sending them to these various areas, and those bishops are supposed to enforce those dates and so on to the rest of Christianity. And he was in charge of writing those, and over those 45 years, he wrote them again every year. Well, in the 39th one, the 39th Festal letter, which happened to be in the year 367, he writes not only the date for Easter, but he begins to write something else about the books of the Bible. And this is, in fact, the linchpin of when most people, most historians would look back and say, this is the formation of the Christian canon. This is it. This is the first real list, the real hard date and list of these things. There are various other ideas about them, but they're sort of fringe theories. All right, so the year 367, when Athanasius sends out this particular letter, he sends it out, and he says in the letter that he undertook the pattern of figuring out what was being used in the churches as far as scripture was concerned and what was being used in the churches in general. And he took that pattern based off of what Luke did in his gospel. We mentioned previously that Luke said he looked at the various sources and determined how to write the narrative about Jesus. So Athanasius is making that claim that that's what he's done. He's talked to these various bishops, he's talked to various churches about what they're using in the church for worship during a time of corporate worship, what things are being read aloud, what things are being read, but not in the same way as Scripture, what things are deuterocanonical, and it means secondary canon. Those secondary canonical books, by the way, are still used in some Protestant and Catholic churches. And then also, there are other things that he calls apocryphal, those things that should not be used inside of the church. And he basically just says anything that he hasn't mentioned that's apocryphal. But I want to mention a few things. So I said, earlier on in this series that the Old Testament, we're just going to take it like it is for now. Later, we'll maybe look into that in another series. But then he takes here from the Septuagint, he says, of the Old Testament, in all 22 books in number, right? Now, the 22 books that he has here, there's 22 because there's some combinations of things that are happening. In the Hebrew scriptures for the Jewish people, there isn't First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, and First and Second Samuel, and so on. There's Kings, Chronicles, Samuel. Those are all one book, and some of the minor prophets are all in one book, and so that makes the number smaller. But the books that he mentions specifically are the books that we have today. And then he looks into the New Testament, and he mentions specifically, right, 27 books by name, which are the same ones, in fact, that we use also still today. And he mentions Paul's letters, and the fact that Hebrews comes after Thessalonians and before the pastoral epistles. He talks about book order in this particular letter. And then he also mentions that a few other things are in this thing. He says, but for greater exactness, I add this also. Consider it necessary so to write that there are other books besides these, not indeed included in the canon, but appointed by the fathers to be read by those who are come of late, wishing for admonition and instruction in godliness. So he talks about these books that are important, but nevertheless not included in the canon. They're not canonical. They're not the rule in the church, but they are absolutely helpful and should be read. And he mentions them specifically: Wisdom of Solomon, Wisdom of Sirach, Esther, Judith, Tobit. The Doctrine of the Apostles are what we would know today as the Didache, Didacheton Apostolon, the teaching of the apostles. If you look up the Didache, you can find the text for that. It's really kind of a church organization manual, essentially telling you, how to baptize people, what's a way to become, closer to Jesus as we live our lives, how should we treat other people, and so on. And he talks about the shepherd, meaning the shepherd of Hermas also. He says, but to the former, they are included in the canon, meaning the ones he mentioned before, Esther, Judith, Tobit, and the like. But to the others, right, they are not included in the canon. They are merely read, he said. Merely read, which means the Didache and the shepherd of Hermas. He says there isn't any mention of apocryphal writings, right? He says, for these are an invention of heretics, writing them in favor of their own views, bestowing them upon their approbation and assigning them a date, and producing them an ancient writing, that thereby they might find occasion to lead astray the simple. And so basically he's saying that people are writing them at that moment and then dating them early in order to try to fool people into believing that what they believe is what the church believes, and that their teachings are older or as old as the Christian teachings that were in place at the moment. Right? That's his claim. Now, what's interesting about this is this particular list is basically the foundation for what we understand as the canon of Scripture. And it's really not dealt with, in fact, in any church council, I believe, all the way until the Council of Trent. So it's during the Counter-Reformation by the Catholic Church when they define what the books of Scripture are. And the reason that they have to do that at that point is because of Protestantism, and because there's a questioning of authority. There's a questioning of authority in general. The scientific revolution is about to unfold, and people are sort of looking at the way that they come to know things, and there's a questioning of that authority. And if people are already questioning the authority of the church, authority of bishops and the Pope and the like, then how in the world they may look at Scripture and determine that this book they don't want to use, or this book they don't want to use. And in fact, that was happening. Martin Luther in the beginning said that the book of James was a book of straw. He didn't like it very much. He liked Romans a lot. He also had no use for the book of Revelation for a long time, until he got crossways with the Pope and then began to say, I kind of like it now. I can use all these words in here against him, and so therefore it's become useful. But for the most part, throughout church history, there's never been a council that has met that has said, these are the books. So how then are we to say that there is a canon of Scripture? And the reasoning behind understanding why there's a canon of Scripture boils down to this simple thing. There were tons of writings in the early church. There are tons of writings today, for that matter. And that has always been throughout Christianity. But what's interesting about the books that we have in our canon is that it isn't that it's surprising that the books that we have, it's that the books that we have are in it because they couldn't be kept out. No matter who would analyze and say, I'm not sure about this thing. Should this be in the canon? Just as Martin Luther did with the book of James. Nevertheless, it is still there. Other books, however, books that we do not have, upon questioning, upon further reflection, were not used as Scripture. They were used as either deuterocanonical, in other words, secondary kind of authority, or they were used simply for admonition and inspiration. Or for instruction, but not necessarily in the way that we would use canonical Scripture. And that is the way in which the canon of Scripture becomes the canon of Scripture. It's not by an act of a council, it's not by the act of a church or a group, it's by the collective response of the church throughout the world. And this is why there's an argument that says that God preserved His Word in that way, because of all of the different ways in which it could have been dispensed with and changed and modified and moved. It wasn't. It stayed present in scriptural form in the way that we have it. And we can go all the way back to the year 367, and that is in fact what was already being used. We don't have a window into an earlier time other than when people are quoting particular passages of Scripture. And in fact, in the early church fathers, you can rebuild most of the New Testament based solely on their quotations. So they're using them extensively. It has always been, from the beginning of the church until now, right? God, who has preserved His Scriptures in the way that they are. And this is the reason for the formation of the Christian canon. It isn't by an edict of Constantine, and it is not a synod of bishops. It wasn't a magical thing that happened, that it floated down from the sky. These things were written by real people in history, but God used them in such a way that they couldn't be kept out. And that's why we have a canon of Scripture today. Thanks for joining me in this series. Hope to see you guys in the next one.